In 1497, a small ship called the Matthew sailed out of Bristol harbour with 18 men on board. They were heading west into the unknown. The man who led them would never return from his second voyage, but the route he opened would transform Bristol from a medieval wool port into one of the richest cities in the world. What followed was a century of sugar, tobacco and human trafficking on an industrial scale, then a mad race to reinvent the city through railways, iron ships and the most ambitious suspension bridge ever attempted. This is the story of how Bristol built an empire and how that empire almost destroyed it. This video uses artificial intelligence to visually reconstruct what Bristol may have looked like across 3 centuries of dramatic change. AI allows us to step into streets and harbours that no longer exist, but some visual details may not be perfectly accurate. The history, however, is real. When the Matthew returned to Bristol in August 1497, the city was already one of the wealthiest ports in England. Its merchants had grown rich on wool and wine. They traded with Ireland, France, Spain and Portugal. But the discovery of new lands across the Atlantic changed everything. Through the 1500s, Bristol merchants followed the routes that Cabot had opened. Tobacco arrived from Virginia, sugar arrived from the Caribbean, and to keep those plantations running, a workforce was needed. In 1698, when the monopoly of the Royal African Company was broken, Bristol's merchants moved fast. The first recorded slaving ship from Bristol, the Beginning, sailed almost immediately. Within a generation, Bristol dominated the trade. By the 1730s, an average of 39 slave ships left the port every year. Between 1739 and 1748, Bristol accounted for nearly 38% of the entire British slave trade. Over the course of a century, approximately 2,100 voyages departed from these docks, carrying an estimated 500,000 people into forced labour across the Atlantic. The wealth that flowed back was staggering. Jamaican sugar was refined in Bristol's sugar houses along the waterfront. Virginian tobacco was processed into snuff and twist. Merchant families built grand townhouses around Queen Square. One of the first banks outside London opened on Broad Street in 1750, founded almost entirely by investors with direct ties to the slave trade. By the mid-18th century, the port was earning an estimated £500,000 a year from slavery and its connected industries. If you're enjoying this journey through Bristol's history, joining the channel as a member would mean a lot for its development. Every bit of support helps us keep rebuilding the past. But Bristol's dominance was already under threat. A younger, hungrier port to the north was growing fast. Liverpool had deeper water, better access to the industrial Midlands, and none of Bristol's geographic limitations. By 1750, the balance of power was beginning to shift. By 1750, Bristol's grip on the Atlantic trade was slipping. Liverpool, with deeper harbours and direct access to the industrial heartlands of Lancashire, was growing at a pace Bristol could not match. In the 1730s, Bristol had controlled nearly 38% of the British slave trade. By the final years before abolition, that share had collapsed to just over 3%. Liverpool now dominated with 62%. The loss of trade brought tension to the streets. In 1793, a dispute over bridge tolls turned deadly. The Bristol Bridge had been rebuilt decades earlier, paid for by public tolls. When the debt was cleared, the tolls were supposed to end. Instead, the authorities renewed them. The crowd burned the toll gates. The militia opened fire. 11 people were killed and around 50 wounded on a single evening, making it one of the worst episodes of state violence in 18th century England. The slave trade itself was abolished in 1807, but not before Bristol's merchant elite fought to preserve it. The Society of Merchant Venturers, the powerful guild that had controlled the port for centuries, organised petitions and lobbied Parliament to delay abolition for as long as possible. Then, in October 1831, Bristol erupted again. The House of Lords had rejected the Reform Bill, which would have given industrial cities like Bristol fair representation in Parliament. Only 6,000 of the city's 104,000 residents could vote. When a judge who had opposed the bill arrived in Bristol, crowds besieged him at Queen Square. The riots lasted 3 days. The Bishop's Palace was burned. Prisons were broken open. The cavalry charged through the square with drawn swords. The exact death toll remains uncertain, but it was devastating. A young engineer named Brunel, who was working on a suspension bridge above the city, was sworn in as a special constable. That bridge would wait 30 more years. If Bristol could no longer compete with Liverpool on trade, it would try to lead the world in engineering. And the man who would make that happen was barely 24 years old. In 1831, Brunel won a competition to design a suspension bridge across the Avon Gorge, a span of over 200 metres, higher than anything attempted before. But the riots halted construction. Funding collapsed. The bridge would not be finished in his lifetime. Brunel did not wait. In 1838, his steamship, the Great Western, became the first purpose-built vessel to offer regular transatlantic crossings, sailing from Bristol to New York. Then, in 1840, the Great Western Railway connected Bristol to London, with Temple Meads station at its heart. Bristol was now just hours from the capital. But Brunel's most ambitious creation was still to come. On the 19th of July, 1843, Prince Albert himself travelled down from London to witness the launch of the SS Great Britain. She was the largest ship in the world. The first ocean-going vessel, built of iron and powered by a screw propeller. She crossed the Atlantic in just 14 days. When she was launched, a newspaper called her the greatest experiment since the creation. Yet even Brunel could not solve Bristol's deepest problem. The Avon Gorge was narrow and shallow. Ships were getting larger, and Bristol's harbour could not keep up. The floating harbour, completed in 1809, had helped by maintaining a constant water level. But it was not enough. The great ships of the future would dock in Liverpool, Southampton and London. Not here. Brunel died in 1859, exhausted at 53. His unfinished bridge hung over the gorge like a broken promise. 5 years later, fellow engineers completed it as a memorial, using chains salvaged from another of Brunel's demolished bridges in London. On the 8th of December 1864, the Clifton Suspension Bridge finally opened. Bristol had lost the race for trade, but it had gained something that would outlast every cargo ship and counting house, a skyline that still defines the city today.